The ABCs? All right. I'll do them backwards. ZYXWVUT.
How do you do that?
Good luck.
Hello, everybody. My name is Lat Mackey, and this is Sequence Break, episode 55. Gelly, and here he is. Gelly, how you doing? Thanks so much for being here.
I'm doing super well, Lat. How are you?
I am doing good. Okay, so before we get started and dive into everything, I'm not sure. So we've actually met once, and I don't know if you remember or not, but this was at the last in-person AGDQ, and a friend who I was rooming with, T. Murdoch, he asked you if you had ever played Myst on the iPad. And apparently, I'm not sure if you'd ever done that before, but it seemed like within 30 seconds, this is when I met you, you had broken completely Myst. You were already speedrunning Myst on the iPad in like no time.
I remember this. Yeah, no, I remember the experience of getting it because it was so out there. He just bought Myst and he was like, here, do it. And I did it. And I was like, hey, this is actually pretty neat. It's definitely rough because I'm usually more of a mouse click pointer guy. But yeah, I got record. Flapjack, who was there, who's also big in the Myst community, he had recorded it. So I think that's still technically the iOS world record or something.
That's awesome.
And yeah, I sort of remember the conversation we had.
That's totally fine.
It's been a while.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, it seems like it's been forever since we've had an in-person event, but then also the fact you meet so many people and you're interacting with so many people at GDQs, right?
Yeah.
So
right, yeah.
Well, to be honest with you, that was actually the first time I watched your speedruns at AGDQ that last year, which incidentally is the last one we ever did in person. But I wasn't familiar with your speedrunning at the time and instantly hooked. I really appreciated your commentary and the performance you were doing, but then also the actual runs of the games and stuff. I just found them fascinating. And ever since then, I've actually tried to find some time to get you on the podcast. My schedule hasn't opened up the way it is. So it's been, I feel like I've been trying to do this for almost a year, even though for you, I just contacted you a couple weeks ago. So
Okay.
I know it sounds a little strange. I hope I'm not making you too uncomfortable already before we even start.
I'm honored. Honestly, that's rad.
Cool. So let's first. I'd like to get to know just a little bit about kind of your gaming and kind of your upbringings through. When did you first start gaming, and what were some of the games that you actually played early on?
So I've probably been on a computer since I was 7. It's really hard to remember, so I'm not going to give you super exact details. But I used to play some really old games that my parents approved of. So like Roller Coaster Tycoon, I think was the first game I'd ever actually played. Like The Sims. I knew about Myst, but I had never played it because they had finished Myst back when it first came out, and I was born after that. So I know little bits and pieces. Later on, for the most part, I did a lot of like online Flash games, like a lot of other kids my age, because we couldn't buy games. So we did a lot of free Flash games. And so there's sort of a propensity for like point and click stuff. I used to play a lot of Escape the Room games, which are sort of point and clicky, although they're very much more bare bones compared to an actual game that's sort of like crafted and people buy it. And then I played a lot of like Minecraft, for example, in like high school. And that incidentally brought me to speedrunning to some extent, although in a weird sort of way. So a big whole mishmash of games. For the most part, Myst in my experience was just a game that I knew about until I actually played it again in like late high school, early college, and got hooked back on it again. So
that's super interesting that you didn't get hit by that thing that like when most people have, so I must be a little bit older than you, because I remember when the game came out and people who are in their 30s like me were it was a thing that kind of changed our idea of what games could be and these worlds and things like that. But I do find it kind of interesting that you didn't mention any consoles. So you guys not have consoles in the house, or just not something you were doing?
No. The first console that we had was the Wii, which and it was way after the Wii came out. Now, my parents were very much dead set against console gaming for the most part. Gaming in general. The reason that they were cool with Myst is because they had played it. And so basically whatever was free and whatever my older sisters had bought, that was fair game, and that was about it. So it was all PC.
No, I really dig that, because like this comes up with almost every guest is, you played what you had access to. And if, a lot of people, games were even $50 and $60 when I was growing up, Nintendo games and stuff. So you rented a lot, and whatever game you could rent for that weekend, that's the game that you played and stuff. So
Nah, it was all free games for me. I mean, we had like a family video couple down the block when I was a kid, but like we didn't even have a console to play it on. So like, you know, no renting games, no nothing like that. It was whatever we had bought and free stuff.
So did you find yourself then, you know, growing up with puzzles, or why do games like that still appeal to you to this day? What is it about puzzle games and things like that that you fell for?
Good question. I'm not very good at them. Every time I try to do them casually, it's an absolute train wreck. Even now, but like, there's an aesthetic in puzzle games that's sort of different to any other type of game, where it's like it's a lot more crafted about like the literal, like how things look and everything like that, rather than like how the game plays. Because as long as the puzzles are decent enough and the game looks good enough, anything else is out the window, including bugs and glitches, which is what I really appreciate. But like, you know, we'll get to that. I guess like with Myst, that was sort of just what I grew up with, and I sort of liked the aesthetic of Myst is fantastic. It's hard to express how like interesting that is, like how, because it's so mysterious.
Right.
Okay, not it has the word Myst in it, but like
Right.
besides that, it's very much, because I remember playing Riven as a kid. We never finished it because Riven is hard as balls. But like we played Riven as a kid, and there were no people, which is so unusual. That's like a restriction of the medium at the time, is that you couldn't have a lot of people in those sorts of games. But it was pretty much empty except for like bits and pieces that you knew that people were around. And so like that's like haunting, but like in a super cool way, like frisson, or like, you know, it's just, there's something there that's really appealing. And there's like a lot of puzzle games. I mean, Myst ruined the puzzle market, the adventure gaming market. So a lot of games followed in its footsteps, and there's still games today like The Witness, which pick up on that sort of creepiness and weirdness and try to like implement it as an aesthetic, and it works. And so I guess there's sort of, I mean, Myst isn't like the end all be all. It's not like play another game, Gelly, but like it's definitely part of that. How I grew up with that is probably a lot of the reason that I have a pull for it, because I'm not good at puzzle games, but I do enjoy playing them at the very least.
No, I couldn't agree with you more on the aesthetic thing. That was the thing, playing that as a kid. And I'm trying to remember where or when. I can't remember where or when I first played it, but I know it was on CD-ROM somewhere, and it might have been a Mac and it might have been a PC. I can't quite remember, but the aesthetic of it, the idea, it felt like you were transported to a different place. And for kids like me, I was, you know, into sci-fi. I really enjoyed thinking about and discovering different places and different worlds. And the fact that you could interact with one, even if it was just a static image, it really, man, it just got the creative juices flowing in the head. Like you could imagine this world, and it felt abandoned. It felt like there was this sense of loneliness, you know, on the island and everything.
Right. Yeah, no, I mean, I from what I've heard, the appeal of Myst isn't like the puzzle games. The reason everyone loved it so much is like the starting island that everyone started out with. Right. Very few people got further than that.
No.
Because it was, you know, that starting island with all the large trees and the water that you could look out on, and the weird clock tower that's over here, and the library over here, and the burnt books. That's all that people needed. I mean, you could buy apparently a CD-ROM drive for that game. It was a killer. Myst was a killer app for that.
Totally
that
was.
Guess. It was a killer app for the CD-ROM, and apparently that was good enough for most people, from what I've heard.
It really
I wouldn't
was.
know because I wasn't around, but
let me tell you, it just felt like, man, this is why you bought a computer, to do things like this, like, you know,
exactly,
to transport you there. So. That's cool. I don't want to gush on it too much, because I might be overselling it, but I do want to. You know, I was telling Gelly before we started recording is that I'm not too familiar with point and click, with adventure, with these puzzle solving type of games. I do know that every time I booted up one, I've had an experience. Like I just enjoy, like it's a joy to get transported someplace different. And even though I struggle, like, I mean, I've only gotten through the first age basically at this point. Still I missed. I still haven't bothered. Figured it. And I've watched all of you speedrun it. Nauseam just showed up in the chat. Like I've watched all of you speedrun it for so long, and yet still I still can't figure it out. But anyway, that's beside the point. We're gonna get there. When did you first discover speedrunning, and kind of what was, like, take us through maybe your first experiencing it, and then maybe trying it yourself?
It's weird. Back when I played like a lot of Minecraft, I used to follow this guy Seth Bling, who did a lot of technical work within the game, Redstone and stuff. And somewhere I had heard that he was in the background of some video in like the audience, and I was like, okay. I mean, cool. I've never seen him before, right? And it was Dram55 running Super Kaizo World.
Oh, no way.
And and Seth Bling was in the audience. He didn't do anything. He wasn't doing any commentary.
Wow.
It was Carl Sagan and someone else who I don't remember. But that's the first speed run proper I probably ever saw. Was that GDQ run that Dram 55 did. And I was like, okay, this is cool, but it didn't really like pull me in, right? Because I wasn't interested in Super Mario World. I never played a Mario game, so I wasn't. I mean, it looked weird, but like, you know, I didn't know how definitely difficult that was. But I was aware of it, so I was like, okay, that's a thing that people do. And then when I started college, I was, you know, hanging out with friends, talking with people, and they were like, you know, I've heard of Myst. Do you know anything about Myst? And I'm like, yeah, I totally do. And then I found out I didn't. It had been like so long that I just had no idea. So I was like, all right, I'm going to get Myst again. And they made a game right about when I was interested in it again called realMyst Masterpiece Edition, which is a remaster of a remaster. It's basically a 3D version of the original Myst game. And so I got that and I'm like, okay, this is cool. And I remembered how to do everything. I remembered how to unlock and everything. And I was like, okay, cool. I get to explore the world and there's like some slight differences and that's cool. How fast could you do this? And I thought, okay, there's got to be a lot of people running this. Myst is a huge game and etc. Now, there was one person, WMD88, who, shout outs to him, he's fantastic.
That's good.
He did a couple of runs and that was it. And I was like, come on. Someone should be able to do better than that, right? And the second time I tried, I got a run that was like 2 minutes better than his time. And I'm like, all right, that's it. We're going to submit this and I'm going to be a world record holder. Isn't that going to be fantastic? And then I did, and I was like, okay, cool, whatever. Is there like anything else? And then I found inadvertently Speed Demo's archive on like the tail end of when it was relevant, and they had realMyst, which was the game that realMyst Masterpiece Edition was remastering. I know it's a whole thing, but I had owned that game and it was garbage. But I was like, they had demos for it, and I was like, oh, this is interesting. So it's like sort of like a not world records, but it's a demonstration of skill in the game. And the things that the guy at the time was doing, Ian Wolfcat, I was like, I could probably do this better and I could probably improve these times decently. And then I did. And then on SDA, I found out about a platformer game called 140 because there were Zet, he's a German speedrunner who knows quite a lot of people. He was advertising on SDA at the time. And I was like, okay, I'll play a little bit of 140. And then I started streaming, and then it just all happened from there. I started meeting people. I joined Discord. I started playing a bunch of other different games like Limbo. And then it just all sort of happened at once from SDA, which is weird because it was 2015. It wasn't like 2012 when SDA would have been super relevant or anything like that. It was right at like the tail end of when SDA was relevant. And since then, I haven't really done anything with SDA or anything like that. But that's how it sort of happened, very slowly and then all at once.
Okay, so. This is super fascinating, and I have a few questions. The first one being, so I host a show on GDQ, and Dram55, I had him on 2 weeks ago, and so the biggest thing that came up and over and over again was how that his runs at GDQ inspired people to try speedrunning. What was it about that? Because that's console Mario. I mean, that's Super Mario World. What was it about seeing that kind of inspired you to think that maybe you could, that just captured you? It was
like a technical dissection of a game that wasn't expected to be technically dissected. It was a very dry and also hyper knowledgeable approach to a video game, which is weird. I mean, like, if you really do think about it, about how they explain like the techniques and like frame perfect, try explaining frame perfect to somebody who has no idea what speedrunning is. Who cares, right? But like, there's a pull there. It's like, what makes people so interested in a video game? How good can a game be to get people this interested, this drawn into things? And later on, I basically retooled that interest into glitch hunting, and I've done like a lot of glitch hunting from there on out. So it must be because, like, again, no idea about Super Mario World. Even now, I couldn't tell you a thing, but it was just the presentation of someone being really good, and also like the knowledge behind it. That sort of pairing there is unusual from somebody who has no idea. So
Yeah, no, that's such a great answer, and it's so interesting because I think that's quite telling then about your approach and what got you interested. And I find the glitch hunting thing super fascinating as well, because when you're seeing a game like Myst where you think you can do it better, that's kind of something that spawns you on to try it for yourself. Are you thinking that, man, I can find game-breaking glitches, or are you thinking that just the actual execution is something that you could do at you could better yourself that way?
So when I'd first seen it, there's this sort of comes into a little bit of a technical explanation. It was an execution thing at first.
Okay.
So realMyst Masterpiece Edition can be played both in like the original sort of point and click method where you click on the screen and it moves you along, but it like transitions you at speed. And then you can also use WASD to move around in the world, right? Mm-hmm. And so you can pick between those two different modes. And I had noticed that the point and click method, which I had chosen because nostalgia, seemed to be a lot faster than what he was doing, which was the using WASD to move around to various places. And so I decided to do a point and click version, the classic mode of it, and it was just a lot faster. I'm like, okay, that's cool. But then in Myst and in all the realMyst Masterpiece Edition, realMyst, etc., there's a section called the Maze Runner, and it is 8 minutes of unfettered clicking on a screen and watching cutscenes happen. And it's horrible, especially for someone like me who can't sit still for longer than 2 minutes. It's torture. It's awful. And like at that point I had found like a bunch of small things that didn't like really matter. It was like small optimizations, but I was like, this is the thing that I want gone, right? More than anything else. I would love playing this game if I didn't have to fuck with that damn thing. So I spent, it must have been 50 hours just dicking around in that area, right? I had found ways to clip out of bounds. Wasn't really relevant because then it would respawn you and so on and so forth. But then just at some point I had figured out the way to do it, which used like 3 different techniques that I had used over time, and I had recorded in videos and posted on SRC at the time. And it just all came together, and suddenly I was able to skip it. And I'm like, holy shit, I've done something, right? And then that dropped the time by like 8 minutes, and then I found a bunch of others, that whole realMyst Masterpiece Edition, I built that game from the ground up, and now it's a whole thing. I mean, there's a couple of people who have had contributions, but for the most part, that whole architecture, that whole arc is just 4 years of me finding various things and sticking them on because I'm like, I hate doing this thing. Can I skip this thing? Okay, it turns out I can't. If I had picked a different game, I would totally anticipate never speedrunning again, because I'd be like, never able to do that. What if they programmed a way to not do it? What if there was just, you never know. If that had never happened, I'm not doing any of this, right? But it was that drag and that thrill. Somehow realMyst Masterpiece Edition, a remaster of a remaster which is super glitchy and broken, had just enough sort of draw to be able to say, here's the next tantalizing thing, and it is possible to achieve. And here's the next thing you can do, and here you can achieve it. And that drew me in. It was huge for me. So
that's so awesome. One of the ways that I prep for our conversation and things like that is I go and I watch your clips. If you stream, I watch your clips on Twitch, and so often it's you finding things or breaking things, sometimes by accident, other times intentionally. You're mentioning your time here with realMyst. Is that the first time that you'd kind of broken a video game or found like a clip or a glitch like that? I'm always curious, because like now I see it seems like you do it all the time, but I know that's not really how it happens. But right. I mean, is that the first time that you'd kind of broken a game like that?
Yeah, because again, all the other previous games, like, Myst is just a bunch of pictures. You can't clip out of bounds with a bunch of pictures. Yeah. Citation needed. I bet you there probably is. But for the most part, there aren't a lot of glitches in point and click games. There aren't a lot of glitches in Flash games. Minecraft is relatively glitchless unless you really dig into it. So a lot of the games that I had played, the glitches weren't relevant or interesting. That was the first one where it's like breaking the game did something, right? Or it looked funny, or really anything, right? I mean, I was aware of glitches existing. There's that really famous video of cartridge tilting with GoldenEye that I had probably watched. Yes. I forget what it's called, but it's got that song behind it. Right. I was aware of glitches happening, but I was like, okay, this is weird circumstances, and in particular, cartridge tilting is weird. But like, I had never like glitched out a game in a way that was interesting or useful, right? You know? So, yeah.
It's really fascinating. I still to this day, like I've noticed there's a couple different approaches to speedrunning. And when Lack Attack was on, he was talking about like he hasn't really discovered anything. He's just he practices, he puts in the time to try to that's definitely a perfectly approachable way to do things. Let's take realMyst for as an example. You've been running this game now for years. Are there still times where you're looking to try to do things, or now is the time when you're at this point in a speedrun? Is it serendipitously something happens where you discover some sort of new thing?
It's always a search.
Okay.
I mean, yeah, especially at this point, like really what my speedrunning experience is 9 times out of 10 is to demonstrate a route, right? It's to do something no one's done before. That's because cool. It's stupid or it's hard or I'm the first one to find it, right? That's the trifecta. So like, for example, Manifold Garden, which I had run at GDQ, I found a bunch of stuff in there. And then I just did a run with it. And that was world record. Great. Maybe I could improve it a little bit by being less messy in certain areas. But like, that's pretty much it. I'm not like opining for perfection. I'm just looking for something to say, hey, if someone else could pick this up from here who's good at this, please do. Because I'm not good at this, right? But I can show you all the things. I mean, realMyst Masterpiece Edition, that's all that is, right? There's only one point where I'll try to optimize something past it, and it's that minute, there's a minute barrier, right? Like recently, my most recent time, I think it broke a minute barrier with some glitches removed or something like that. And I was like, okay, I'm going to grind for this a little bit because it would be nice to have a sub X because we're humans and we like patterns or whatever, But like, other than that, for the most part, any world record that you look at in that game, that's all just me finding a new glitch and being able to utilize it. And that's it. Shivers, the game that I'm running most recently.
Yes.
That was a game where I was trying to learn the route and the speed run for it so that I could TAS it. And then it turned out I was really good at it. And I was able to utilize and come up with routes that no one else wanted to do because it's extremely luck-based. I mean, that entire game is extremely luck-based. But I don't care. I've done stupider. While I talk to so many people who are like, yeah, I like speedrunning, but I don't like finding the routes or anything like that. I can't imagine doing that. That would kill me because I'm really bad at optimization, and it really hurts to like make a mistake that matters. And, for the most part, a lot of the time that I spend is routing and glitch hunting. And so like, that's the impetus of my speedrunning almost entirely, is being able to demonstrate something.
So I think I'm a little bit more in your ballpark. My approach to speedrunning is definitely, I enjoy finding the routes for myself. And then once I've gotten my skills to a certain level, then I go, oh, what are other runners doing? That's when I'll start looking. And I agree with you. I think there's a certain joy in that, but also the sense of discovery. And I find that's the way you actually learn the game, personally. I know that's not for other people. They'd like to learn it the right way the first time, which is, I think, a reasonable way. But I'm with you where it's like, how are you going to enjoy the game if you haven't discovered these things for yourself?
Exactly. Yeah. And I to continue on that a little bit, I think it's important to have casually played a game as well, which is a thing that I've encountered people who are like, yeah, no, I've just speedrun this game. I've never casually completed this game. That's wild to me because like, how are you going to, what if you absolutely soft lock something in like a marathon, right?
Yeah.
Do you know the backups for it? Do you know the casual route for it? And it's not like gatekeeping particularly or anything like that. If you can do that, go ahead. I just can't imagine it for myself, because if I would make a mistake in the speed run, suddenly you have to restart, right?
What happens?
You can't do that. Yeah. So,
and unfortunately, we've seen it a few times in marathon runs where runs just have to stop because the runner doesn't quite know what to do. I mean, it's unfortunate, but you're right. That's like, what do you do? How do you get out of this?
Right.
And you may discover something.
Some runs are just built like that. I think the Pokemon Silver one is the one that I know best, where Kizaron just had a really bad time with the RNG. I think there was a Legend of Zelda 2 speed run where the glitch ended because he died, and that just sucks because you wouldn't expect that to happen.
Oh yeah, the scroll lock. Yes.
Yes. Those you remember, but that's still. I mean, that's interesting. That's definitely something that I remember those runs more than if they were completed correctly, right? But at the same time, that would kill me personally. I don't think I'd come back from that. So,
So I do want to get into some of the technical stuff and some of the nuts and bolts, but I do want to ask you, you mentioned that you were, you picked up some of this stuff while you were in college and stuff. If you don't mind, what were you going to college for, and what's kind of a little bit of does that influence at all your gaming or your speedrunning?
Yeah. So I went to an engineering school for computer engineering. So yeah, I got to learn a lot about like the particulars of like assembly and stuff like that, which I'd love that to be relevant, but it's not more often than not. I mean, I'm able to disassemble games to some extent and be able to look at the logic and say, hey, but it's usually with tools that other people build, and that's just a matter of reading the code. I do build auto splitters. I used to build a lot of auto splitters, but like I know the ASL like decently, and I have some amount of rapport with that. But that doesn't super influence the speedrunning. But a lot of the work that I'm doing now in my job is it's reverse engineering and vulnerability research and breaking stuff. So I managed to turn my hobby into an actual job, and it's great. It's a perfect fit. So. 100% my career has influenced my speedrunning and back and forth. I mean, I used GDQ on my resume, right? Because I had done a GDQ, and then they were like, "Hey, that's cool," and it was a good moment. So yeah, no, one and the other, they both influence each other. So.
It constantly comes up on this podcast, but I've met so many speedrunners who are also engineers or developers or have some sort of technical background or something they use in a day job. It's like teachers and developers or coders, these are the type of people apparently that speedrun. I know there's other types out there, but for some reason, the people who end up on this podcast, and I think that's really interesting, and I can see how one goes hand in hand. It seems like some of those, you mentioned reverse engineering, but problem solving and an order of things. And, I find there's got to be some overlap or some connection there between speedrunning and that aspect of things.
Right. Yeah.
Super interesting. Okay. So before we get into a little bit of a deep dive into some of the games that you speedrun, if somebody was interested, or like myself, like where do you even start with, speedrunning a puzzle game or a game on PC? Like, are you using special hardware, or what's even accepted on leaderboards? How does some of that stuff work?
I mean, if you have a mouse, that's usually good enough. Keyboard probably helps. I mean, like, no, there's, as far as I'm aware, there's no special hardware that's ever used for runs because, especially with how ubiquitous PCs are, you don't want to ever have to force someone to buy something to speed run at like a decent level. And I mean, there's a whole discussion to be made about like hand cams or video cams or being able to stream. That's a whole thing. I have no idea. I don't have a stance one way or the other. But at the moment, it seems to be more often than not a very lax approach where it's like whatever you can get, use it.
Cool.
And ban the things that other people can't use. Like I have a free scroll wheel mouse. Any game that I moderate or I'm a part of, free scrolling is banned because not everyone can do that, right? Not everyone can set the wheel going. So, basically it's as bare bones as possible in terms of the hardware. There's nothing special that you have to buy. You don't even really have to stream as long as you can get like OBS, keyboard and mouse, maybe not even a keyboard for certain games, right? More often than not, there's not special hardware. I mean, there's VR games, but that's a whole different can of worms, right? But like for the most part, anyone can start with what they got. So,
are there ever any restrictions on frame rate and things like that as the hardware gets more popular? More powerful. Because I can run games at 120 frames a second. Does any of that stuff kind of exist for the games that you run or in the community?
Yeah, let's talk about the Talos principle. So there is a game, the Talos principle, which is a game from 2014. It's made by Crow Team, who did Serious Sam, and it's a puzzle game. But it's in the speedrun form. It's very like parkour heavy, and I think it's super interesting. From that perspective. It's got like 20, 30 different glitches that people have found over the years, routes, etc. It's wild, but one of the biggest things about it that I think differentiates it from almost any other game that I've ever seen is that whatever frame rate you can get, go for it. And it matters hugely. Like there are some categories that can only be run if you have good enough hardware to get the frame rate. And by good enough, I mean like actually good enough. Like I had a top of the line CPU, and I was probably one of the only people that could run this category called community percent, which is basically a low percent modified. It was very bizarre, but it relied on having like 1,000 FPS in a 3D game. And
did you just say 1,000?
Sort of, yeah, like 1,000, yeah. in like walking around, yeah, no, nobody could get, almost nobody. I mean, nowadays people can,
right?
But like 4 years ago, the hardware was a little bit different. And yeah, I was one of the few people who could, and we just said, not that many people run it. For the main categories, having too much of an FPS is a disadvantage because you go too high. So we just said, screw it, why not? And it makes it look very silly. And I mean, it could be argued that maybe that shouldn't have been allowed, but it was. I mean, it's in those particular categories, it wasn't that popular. I mean, Talos Principle is sort of popular. It's sort of up there, but like the category that I'm talking about, comp%, only like 3 or 4 people have ever run it. So it's basically off to the side. It probably should have been a category extension at one point, but like, who knows? Right. So but that's the only example that I'm aware of. Talos Principle, where having super ultra stupid hardware is almost a requirement to be able to succeed in that. More often than not, you expect to see something like VSync, or in rare instances, I think Rivatuner is an FPS limiting software for things that don't have VSync, just to force everyone to have 60 FPS. Especially now that people have monitors that are more than 60 FPS, I think that's a solution that's being used because VSync matches to your monitor, so you have to put it lower than that sometimes. More often than not, to level the playing field. Especially as computers are getting more and more powerful, I think I'd be expecting to see a lot more frame rate letting. Although at the moment, VSync seems to do wonders for everything at the moment. So, yeah.
Since you brought it up, I'd love to chat a little bit about it, because I've found that was one of the things because I've only followed you over the last year or so, I'm going back through your back catalog of Talos Principle PBs when I was prepping for this, and the game just looks endlessly fascinating to me. What was like your first experience with Talos Principle, and what was like your casual playthrough of it? Is this a game you knew that you wanted to break apart when you started playing it?
That's weird to mention. Yeah, so the Talos Principle, a friend of mine had mentioned what the Talos Principle was, and he had recommended it to me, and he almost never recommended games to me. So I'm like, all right, sure, I'll follow through on it. And at the time, I had this dog shit laptop. It was only barely able to run the game as it was.
Oh no!
And so I played it casually. I got actually pretty decently far before my FPS was actually too low to functionally play the game. Like there's a section in the game where you can record like previous versions of yourself holding a platform, and then your current version of yourself can stand on top of that platform. My FPS was so low that it didn't have good enough collision to keep me on. So I just stopped playing the game because I'm like, okay, I just don't have the hardware for this. This is ridiculous. I can't play the game normally. And then a couple of years later, once I had built my own PC, I came back to it. I didn't even finish the rest of the game casually because I'm like, at that point I was speedrunning. So I'm like, all right, I'll just break the game and fuck around with it. This seems cool.
Totally.
And then, I'd finished the game. I looked at, all the endings. I mean, to some extent I do know the casual puzzles now, but like 9 times out of 10 for the ones that I'm skipping, like you can just jump around a thing and that'll do good enough. And that's not to shit on the devs. Let's not misinterpret me here. All I'm saying is that at that point they don't expect people to have, because it's not a game that's built for parkour and all the stuff that we do for it, right? It's a game that's definitely built to be walking around to slowly amble through things. So if you can like figure out how to jump across walls and everything, then you could do basically whatever. So if the devs don't expect that, and honestly the devs shouldn't, because like most casual players aren't going to figure that sort of stuff out. It's irrelevant. It's whatever.
Watching there are many different categories of the game as well, but watching your PBs that are on speedrun.com, the first thing that struck me was like, where are all the puzzles? Like the 80%, I mean, there was like 2 of them or something. Like there was very, and I was like, that's not the game I remember seeing. But then you explaining this parkour stuff sounds like, okay, that makes sense to me now.
Right. I think Azure, who's the big proponent for the game, he had a world record in Portal, and then he moved over to Talos, and that's basically the majority of what he's done since at GDQ. He always mentions that when doing all of the puzzles, the category all sigils, which is all the puzzles. There's only 2 of them that you do intended. And that's sort of questionable because the third one might be intended. So yeah, the rest of the game is just a breakdown between various different glitches and hopping on walls, etc. So yeah. I mean, it's as a speed game, it's built completely different than its casual counterpart.
Nausea brings up an interesting point that I wanted to ask you about. When after a mouse that he had broke, he spent $70 on a mouse that he bought specifically to play and speed run games like Myst. At this point, now that you've done speed running for a number of years, either 4, 5, 6 years, whatever you've been doing it for, are you considering that when you purchase a new mouse or purchase a new keyboard, how well you can do some of these things on it?
I splurge, yeah. I mean, the current keyboard that I have was gifted to me because it used to be blue mechanical switches, and my friend of mine, Yajiji, he was so annoyed by it, by how loud the key clacking was, that when I went to ESA Summer, he gave me a keyboard and he's like, use these switches, they sound quieter. And I'm like, all right. And it works. So like, I'm not going to complain. It works just fine. But if I were to buy a new keyboard, most of the consideration would be, does it feel like it used to, or is this going to completely throw me off? For mice, good question. I don't know. I mean, I could probably get away with a cheap mouse, but like, if I'm going to be using this on a regular basis, I want it to be sturdy. I want it to last for a long time, and I want it to feel good. So like, the ergonomics of the current mouse that I have, which is a G502 Hero, it's the top of the line mouse. I mean, I bought 2 of them on accident, but I'm using both of them. One for work inadvertently, and the other one for stuff. And they last a long time. They work extremely well. And yeah, part of that consideration is how heavily I perhaps abuse the equipment that I have. It does matter because I use these completely different than like someone who types on a regular basis or someone who is schooling on a regular basis. Completely different use style. Yes. Someone isn't going to be typing WASD in an essay 5,000 times over and over, but that's basically what I'm doing. So yeah, that it's 100% important. Yeah.
I'm laughing because the stuff that that becomes important to us when we start speedrunning. I primarily run games on TurboGrafx 16. I have 10 TurboGrafx 16 controllers because I've worn out 3 of them, and it's something ridiculous. But also the shit you have to worry about when you're streaming. Like I have a keyboard that feels really good, but the clicking and clacking was driving me crazy. So I could only imagine how crazy it was driving the people watching. So I'm like, well, I got to get one that's more quiet,
Right? Yeah.
Never ending.
There's an era of time somewhere in my PVs. I don't know exactly when I was using blue switches, and those keys probably sounded louder than I did. Even though I loved how they felt to death, and these keys aren't quite as good. The sanity is worth it.
It's a compromise. It most definitely is.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about Myst, and at this point, how many? Let's talk about the series a little bit. There are a number of games, and I'm not even sure how many mainline games there are at this point. I'm sure you might know. Are there differences between individual games as far as speedrunning goes, or is the approach kind of the similar, where you're trying to look for things that you can break and routes that you can take?
Every single game is different.
Okay.
Myst to Riven are probably the closest ones, but from there it just tumbles off in a weird sort of way. As far as I'm aware, the only time that one person held 3 world records out of any of the mainline games was Viovis back in like 2014. And ever since then, everyone's had a different specialty in a game, right? Like at the moment, one person has the world record for Riven, which is the second game, and Revelation, which is the 4th game, which have completely different skill sets. And like, that's it. Everyone else has a different record in all the different games. So it's completely different from each one. I could break it down for each one if that's chill. I don't know.
I would love to, only because I remember when I was my first experience with a lot of these was GDQ or with whatever I saw Nauseam speedrunning on his stream. So when I saw Exile, I'm like, this looks completely different than what I just watched before this. So I would love to hear a little breakdown if you don't mind.
Right, sure. So a lot of the pull with Myst is it's just you click with left click, and that's all about you can do. There is a little bit of tech with zip nodes, which is something that was implemented later, which is basically if there's something that the game expects you to come to on a regular basis often, the first time that you go there, and you basically activates a zip node, which basically when you're a distance away from it and you're looking at it, normally when it takes you like 5 clicks, you can like hover over it and it gives you like a little lightning strike and you go there instantly, right?
Yeah, that's
so
nice.
it's like mini fast travel, right?
Yeah.
And so there's like a little bit of that in Myst, but it's not super relevant. When it comes to Riven, in Riven, they implemented keyboard controls that you could use instead of clicking, which is nice. So you could like, I don't remember what the default keys are. They're ridiculous, which is why we remap them. But like, you could press W to go forward instead of clicking, or you could click Q to go up left, or what its interpretation of up left is. So there's this whole technique called galloping where you use the keyboard for one click and then you click with the mouse with the other and you alternate between that, and it's just blitzing, right? And especially for some certain sections, you have to memorize the certain keyboard presses that you can get away with and what you can't get away with. And it's basically hyper down to every single section of the game is dependent on, do I press QSA here? And you listen to the tutorials, they sound absolutely ridiculous. Yeah. But yeah, it's basically, you have to have an understanding of both like the spatial keyboard that you're working with and also the screen for the mouse that you're working with, and you're trying to get those to alternate. The other thing that's interesting about Riven is that it has some randomized elements. Myst is the same way every time in terms of like a practical playthrough. Yeah. For Riven, there are things that you have to memorize. There's at least 3 different codes that you have to memorize over time. Although technically, you can skip past the entire game by guessing the code at the very beginning, which I had the honor of being the very first person to do so, although it's a 1 in like 3,000 chance to get like a proper code.
Oh my
Again,
God.
That's it's stupid hard, Right.
So I was the first to do it. 3,000 attempps, and you start bringing up your sample size properly.
It was less than that, but it was definitely arduous to say the least. But for the most part, for people who aren't me, they basically go look for the code, they memorize it, and then they have to come back, and that's different. So that like mixes up the game a little bit every time.
Interesting.
In Exile, the movement style there is completely different. It has something called auto walk, which is you can hold a key on your keyboard, and if you like have a Word document open and you have like you press F and it goes F.
Yes,
it's basically the same thing but with your keyboard. So if you hold down a key, it'll just blitz forward as fast as it can, basically clicking as fast as the keyboard can put out an input. So you can move your mouse around while you're holding down this key, and it's like trying to control an out of control roller coaster that's basically, sometimes you'll accidentally go to the left instead of the right and you have to like turn around, and it's very bizarre. I've never gotten a hang of it. It's the game that I'm the worst at out of the main 5.
I got to tell you, when I saw that being run, I was either close to the screen, and I get motion sick pretty easy. I actually had to move back a little bit because I actually got a little bit sick watching it, and I was like, what is going on? It's not a normal thing I was used to seeing, to say the least.
Yes, completely different. It's just wild. That's all I'm going to say. Right. I wish I was a better expert at that game, but I just don't have the ability, the capacity for it. It's completely out of left field.
Right.
Revelation exists. Myst 5. No, I'm sorry. So Revelation is the black sheep of the game. It's the bad one, but so every time that you make a movement, it has to load the next node because it's so detailed in where you can turn around and everything that it has to load the entire thing, which sucks because it gives you almost no ability to go fast in like a direction or anything like that. You're just trying to click as fast as possible. There are some strats that are actually super interesting. I mean, I used to have the world record in the game, so I like the game a little bit more than I should perhaps. Like there's camera manipulation where the game normally tries to drag your cursor to a particular spot on a screen in order to give you attention to it. However, if you have your cursor closer to that point, whenever you get to that point, it does less dragging. So for example, if the game, you walk into a room forward and then the game turns you very slowly to the right, instead what you can do is you can drag the mouse from left to right and then click like in the middle, so you go forward but your cursor just keeps going, and so by the time you reach the next room, your cursor will be much closer to the point that it expects, and it's very interesting. The most recent record does it a lot better than I do, but other than that, it's basically just a lot of clicking and watching cutscenes, which is a blast because the acting is horrible, etc. But other than that, it tends to be just sort of the same puzzles and over again. Except there's one randomized puzzle that's sort of interesting, but like it is what it is. And then Myst 5 is probably the closest to like a mainline Myst game that I would find the most interest in, because in that game you can walk around or you can point and click. And there's techniques that you can do to switch between those, where you can like so if you're walking around and you switch to point and click, it can't just move you to point and click. It has to put you in a place where the game would expect you to be point and clicking, right?
I gotcha.
So if you're walking somewhere the game totally doesn't expect you to be, it basically puts you to the closest point, which could be like all the way down an elevator shaft, or through a bridge or something like that, right? And Myst 5 uses that heavily, especially for the mainline category, where this extremely long game with these arduous cutscenes should take a very long amount of time. But instead, the cutscenes that you're forced to watch constitute 80% of the run, and then the rest of it is just clipping through bridges and then drawing on tablets. And it's very ridiculous. I love it. I used to hold the record where I hold the record in the vanilla category, but that's because nobody wants to run it because that has the cutscenes in it.
Oh, right.
So there's a category where they remove the cutscenes, and so it goes from 11 minutes and 57 seconds to 2 minutes and 40 seconds. And so there's a lot more optimization in the category that removes all of those really bad cutscenes. But that's the closest to what I started out with, realMyst Masterpiece Edition. It's a lot less awful because like Myst 5 is from 2005 and realMyst Masterpiece Edition is from 2014. So they updated a lot of things. The game doesn't look like dogsick. It controls a lot more consistently, but it's still very broken. And that's nothing. Again, that's nothing against the devs, because in a puzzle game, unlike a lot of other games, if there's a glitch where you like go out of bounds and a casual won't find it, they won't fix it because they don't need to, because it doesn't change the playing experience for most people. Whereas like in Half-Life or whatever, where you have like bunny hopping or whatever, when they patched that was a whole thing. And there was a reason that they patched it, because it changes how the game plays for even casual people to some extent. So puzzle games in general, and especially for the Myst games, they don't care if stuff is broken. Like one time I think I reported a glitch and they're like, yeah, we knew about that. And then they didn't do anything about it. And I don't blame them, because it doesn't matter. Like nobody's going to do the sequence of inputs that I did there. So, it's basically, yeah. So there, and then there's one more game that I do have to mention, Uru, which is sort of, oh, go ahead.
No, I said, please. This is fascinating. I'm loving this.
Okay. There's one more game, Uru, which is a third-person game that was slated to be an MMORPG, but it completely fell on the ground. Ubisoft, who was like in control of it, basically let the project to die. But they turned it into a single-player game that was sort of tied into the main line. I think actually it's the only canon game. I'm not going to get into the canonicity of how Myst is not canonical in its own universe. That's not a discussion I am allowed to have. But the thing that's very interesting about Uru is just that it's like the glitches and the out of bounds that are there are a lot more primitive compared to like Myst 5 and realMyst Masterpiece Edition, where again it's third person and there's only so much that you can do, but it makes a huge difference in how good the game plays for you, how fast you can play it, right? And so basically it's a lot of going in a straight line, right? Trying to optimize your lines as much as possible, trying to make the correct sort of movements, and then attempting this really difficult skip. And if you don't get the skip, it's over. And if you get the skip, then fantastic, the run lives. And I haven't really gotten into Uru. I've played the meme category, which is literally a puzzle where you wait for 15 minutes in a DLC. And that's the only category that I'm any good at, is because it's 3 minutes of doing something and then 15 minutes of waiting for the game to finish. But other than that, I'm not really an expert in Uru. I could talk about like the things in it, but I couldn't tell you how to do them. But that again, completely off in its own different universe, like every other game is. They're almost not connected. The skill sets don't quite match up more often than not. So
I do have to say, hearing you describe all of these, all of them definitely have their own thing. Like, I mean, it doesn't seem like, unless I'm misunderstanding, your skills from realMyst Masterpiece Edition don't exactly apply to Riven. It sounds like it's almost a completely different skill set because of the way that the games are programmed and things.
Absolutely. Yeah. Again, like I can get decently good at these other games in the category, and in fact, I've run the anthology before, where you run all the games. But that doesn't mean that I'm good at all of the games. It's just because I like the Myst universe so much that I'm sort of compelled to want to be able to play all these games. You know, some of them I'm much better at than others. I'm really bad at Exile, the middle one, like I mentioned, because it's just out of control, something I can't control. Some people can. It's just something that I'm unable to do. Whereas with Revelation, I used to be one of the best at it for a very long time, until Jaffa came in and absolutely blasted the category out of the water. And to some extent used that skill to Riven, but not like extremely. Again, because you can't even go backwards, because like even though Revelation is slower and you're able to have like, you know, some amount of control there, you know, neither skill set applies to each other, because you know, one has a lot of weighting between each input and the other one has almost no weighting between each input. And so the only two that you would think, like Myst and Riven, you would think that those might have like skill sets that apply to each other. But like the top player for Myst doesn't play any of the other Myst games. He's Plank Boy, who he runs. He's a master expert when it comes to point and click. I've made TASs for some of the like Freddy Fish games and stuff like that, and he's frustrated when he's not within a second of that TAS. That's how damn good he is. So yeah, but he won't play any of the other games, and nobody else is going to be able to dethrone him. So that's just his game now. No one else is going to touch it. And so yeah, and people who are good at Riven, it doesn't quite work when it comes back to Myst. It's bizarre. It's something I wouldn't have expected, because like when you look at a lot of other, you know, game sort of things, like there are people who are good at all the Halo games or all the Jax games, or you know, the Space Quest games, to talk about something in an adventure genre.
Yeah.
You know, a lot of that sort of skill set works the same, but each of the Myst games iterates, and like I think it has to do with how Cyan plans out games, because when they made Myst, it was revolutionary. It was breaking, and it was expected of them from every game on out to be revolutionary in some way. And so, you know, Myst was revolutionary for having the very detailed renders and having a different sort of play style than you would expect. Riven was revolutionary in doing that, but to a T, and very, very expansive and very good looking. And the lore, they were able to include people to some extent. Exile continues on that by, you know, now it's not just a picture that you're looking at, but it's like a globe that you're looking at. And so you can move your cursor around in order to see these sort of different landscapes. Revelation expands on that even more with, it has like very much more different graphical effects. I mean, at this point, once you're getting to this point, it's all about how it looks and not the puzzles. And I don't like that. I don't appreciate it, but I see where they're going. It has to be more and more fantastical as you keep going. And then Myst 5, it was Myst 5. They tried to make it so that you could have characters who were like 3D rendered in the world, and they had their faces on their differently textured. And that's experimental for sure. I don't know if it's revolutionary, but that's, I think, a lot of the reason why Cyan games are different between each. The company that made these, they're different between each of them, is because they're trying to push the envelope for every single game they make. And so it's completely different as you keep going. So hopefully that makes sense. No,
it totally does. And I think these are, you know, thinking about these games, I'm looking up their release dates. Myst was released in 1993, Myst 5, End of Ages 2005. So it's an interesting era of gaming to me. One, because console gaming is really popular this time, and so the fact that we still got some releases like this in that PC era just is, I think, I mean, Myst to me still to this day, it feels like it put PC gaming on the map, or it, you know, it created this thing. I'm curious from the speedrunning perspective, you know, this is not the most popular time to release patches and updates and things like that for your games. They just, you know, they made a new game, they released a new game. Is there any sort of rules or anything like that on what version you must be are there different versions of these games that, you know, if you're going to submit a time, you know, for that type of thing?
Yeah, there's sort of. So the first game that I'm aware of that had a patch was Revelation, because when they released it, Revelation coming out in like 2003, I think, it was broken in a way that was hard to reconcile. It was a timing based puzzle, and it was a really bad timing based puzzle, and most people couldn't get it. So they released a patch for that on like some forum somewhere, and that was about it. And then Myst 5 was released on Steam, so they were able to patch it. I'm not sure if they did, because it's very broken and it's almost impossible to run on modern computers. But like, it's possible. I could see that. But yeah, all the previous games, for the most part, it's the same version, except for the fact that very recently they released the 25th edition or 25th anniversary of Myst edition of all these games. So they wanted everyone to be able to play them on Windows 10, right?
Right.
And so the way that they did that is they commissioned ScumVM, which is a virtual machine sort of thing that can emulate games. They commissioned them to come up with a particular version of their open source engine to work specifically for Myst, for Riven.
I had no idea. That's so cool. I had no idea that's the way it worked. Yeah. That's so cool.
It's super interesting. Yeah. Not only because now everyone uses ScumVM for that, but also earlier versions of ScumVM will also run Myst, and that's how people used to run Myst before that came out. And as it turns out, the earlier versions of ScumVM fucked it up, and there's a bunch of like skips that shouldn't exist in Myst, but people will still run with those versions. So we have to separate those boards just like slightly. I think Myst is the only one where it matters, where we have SVM standard, where it's the version that came out with that 25th anniversary edition, which is pretty much as Myst was intended to be played. And then there's SVM free, where they messed up a valve where you can turn it instantly instead of it taking 15 seconds in the standard game. And so people will run each of these versions, and but that's really about it. Other than that, everyone pretty much is on the level playing field with 25th anniversary edition onward, because it's really the only version most people can play.
Right.
And if you could run an earlier version, the loading times are going to sink you. So that's pretty much it. We inadvertently got standardized across the board with the 25th anniversary edition, and I'm very thankful for it, because otherwise it could have been rough.
You know, when you and I started out talking here, it sounds like for both you and I, the world, the atmosphere, the whole, place that we step into when we play a Myst game is things that sucked us in. There's this. I remember watching this documentary. I think it was with Ron Miller. Is that the name of the guy who?
Rand Miller.
Rand Miller.
Likely, yeah.
Thank you. Yes, and it was just interesting to hear his take. He's one of the developers at Sign. I think he founded the company or something, and. To hear his approach to like puzzles and how that was where they started, but they knew that they started with artists and things like that. I found the whole process of how they got to what the games that we got, and it makes total sense when you hear about their process, when they had these they were working on art and things, but also the puzzles. It's no wonder we got the game that we did, but I've always found that fascinating that was it would almost seem like a different approach to gaming. It wasn't just let's try out to see if Mario can jump from platform to platform. It was something just completely different. I still respect that they chose to try these different things and to know that happens throughout the series, because I haven't played past Riven, so it's interesting that that's one of those. They keep trying things and experimenting with things throughout the series. You're getting a different experience when you go play these other games.
Right. And in terms of the development differences, I watched, I think I watched like a little mini documentary on that about how they explained sort of the different development, and like, most of what they were trying to do was the graphics, but like the puzzles are also integrated well enough in the environment that it works out, and it's actually quite interesting. A lot of people say Riven did it even better, although that's a fandom wank thing.
They also had 4 years of technology. I mean, you're talking about
4 years of technology, a lot a lot to throw around with that game.
Myst was the biggest game on the on the PC at the time. So
the way that they did it is extremely influential in not only how well that game came together, but also games of the future, because now so it ruined adventure games. There's a whole you talk to the wrong sort of people, and they'll be like, Myst is, because before Myst you had a lot of games like Monkey Island and Space Quest, where you're moving your little character, and that was the adventure game genre. And then Myst came out, and then everyone's making Myst clones, and for better or for worse, it completely transformed, almost in a very negative way, how people looked at. There's in various different genres this happens like a lot, where there will be someone who's so successful that they ruin the rest of it for everyone else, and then it goes out. I'd like to think that's not how it happened for puzzle games, because to some extent their puzzle games are back on the rise. There's definitely some more modern puzzle games that definitely derive their, you know, like The Witness, the Talos principle. I think Portal to some extent definitely has that environment with the puzzle sort of thing.
Yeah.
Definitely evolving from that in an interesting sort of way. So yeah, no, I think that, yeah, that revolutionary attempt, and of course they didn't succeed with all the games, but at least they tried, you know, and they're still trying now. They came out with a game called Myst 20, which is like the definitive edition of Myst.
Yeah.
And it's exclusively in VR right now. And that's exactly what I would expect from them, because they're looking to forward a technology that really is, at the moment, there's no like killer app for VR, and Myst is probably not going to do it, but I admire them for, at the very least, trying to come up with some sort of product that, as they develop and work with these new technologies, try to get everyone. And, you know, once you have enough people producing it, then everyone can experience VR because it's cheaper to produce and so on. So they're still doing it now, which is wild to me. But yeah, no, it's a completely different paradigm to what you'd expect from like any other game studio. So
there's no denying the impact that Cyan has had on the games we play today, right? You know, so yeah. I just looked it up. It's the My Life in Gaming guys who did a documentary on it. It's from about 5 or 6 years ago, but I think the conversation is still interesting. And I would recommend, if you haven't watched it yet, please consider it, because it's interesting to hear their approach and how we've gotten these games. I want to share just a brief thing. So I've recently been playing through a game that came out in 2006. It's called Scratches. I don't know if you ever played through this one, but it's a point-and-click suspense adventure game, as they call it. And for me, for a person who came from traditional console gaming, platforming, those type of things, it almost seemed, I don't want to say backwards, but a little bit counterintuitive to how I am used to thinking about games, in that, you know, take a step back and think about something holistically, or think about how you might logically get through one step to another. And that's been a real challenge for me. On the flip side of it, when I actually have figured out something, sometimes with the help of the chat, sometimes without, it's been really satisfying. Like, there is something satisfying to having your brain be able to figure something out like that. So, you know, kudos to Cyan for tapping into that.
Yeah, cool. Yeah.
What are some of the you know, you mentioned Shivers. Tell me a little bit, like, what have you been like? How do you challenge yourself nowadays? I mean, you've played through all of these. I mean, there are still ways to break them open as speedrunners. We always want to keep going. What are some games that have interested you recently?
Yeah. So Shivers is the one that I've been doing most recently. A game from 1995 came out after Myst, very heavily inspired by Myst, but it's like a horror. It's a horror point and click game by Sierra. It's very cheesy, but it's also it's very close to sort of emulating that sort of experience with like Myst. Seventh Guest was another one that I very recently played and liked a lot. Those sorts of games that also have that first player perspective, very cheesy sort of thing. That's gotten me more into point and click. For the most part, I'm very good at like the 3D part of things, like with realMyst Masterpiece Edition. That was very WASD and looking around, first person 3D puzzle games. So like, for example, Superliminal, a very popular speedrunning game. I did a lot of work with that game as much as I could. Maquette is a game that came out sort of recently that also has a different sort of twist on 3D puzzle games. That was a game that I looked at for a bit. I'll have to get back to it. For the moment, I put it on the back burner because the problem, especially with the game like Maquette, where like the story is the entire focus of it. The story is bad, and so for some reason that just pushes me away from the speedrunning. Even though the speedrunning is wild, for some reason, you know, when I want to speedrun a game, it's because I want to experience that sort of environment over again, and it's one of the best ways that I can. And I don't really want to experience the environment of Maquette again, even if the game speedrunning is technically and very, very challenging and interesting. So I guess that's sort of the drive that I'm looking at, is find a puzzle game that's like good casually, see if it's a good speedrun, which happens to be rare. You almost never get the two together, but if you do, I'd get sucked into it. So yeah, for the moment I've been doing Shivers, which is about as good as it gets at the moment. And then from there, I have no idea. I might go back to one of the games that I have run in the past that I feel like I could do a little bit better in, I might find another game. Who knows? I leave it open.
That's always good. You mentioned earlier Sierra. It seems like Sierra's been brought up a couple times when I've been playing through scratches here, and there's a fair amount of rage directed at Sierra for a certain era of gaming where it seems like I remember King's Quest because that was the game that came out when I was younger, but like games that, pushed your patience, to say the least, on how to actually figure out the damn thing.
Yeah. No, Shivers definitely follows in the footsteps where it has what I call, the puzzles that weren't meant to be solved, and you were meant to call a hotline where you'd pay $10.99 per minute or whatever, and they'd tell you, just do this thing or buy our guidebook. Sierra always did that. Cyan, I always give puzzle games like 2 puzzles that are bullshit, because like you can't be batting one. You're gonna make a mistake somewhere, and every puzzle game is allowed to have 2. And Sierra really pushes it. They really do, because they do have the 2 bullshit puzzles, but they're meant to almost not be solved, it feels like. So I haven't played a lot of the previous games, but I've heard there's a very similar sort of sentiment where there's just something stupid in there. And that is a dark time for adventure speedrunning, but some people love that. I don't know. It's a matter of preference.
I do want to ask you about it, because you did mention it while we've chatted that you've done some tasking and you've tried tasking and things like that. How does that work for a game on PC? We're used to BizHawk in the console world. Your traditional, you can go frame by frame. Do tools like that exist, or how do you do tasking on a PC?
Yeah, so there's a tool called libtas, which was made by I'm not going to remember his name. He's very influential in the tasking community. He basically built libtas for Super Meat Boy. Cool. And he made this tool that on Linux, it's able to take any sort of program and replay a list of inputs for it. And it's basically you play the game frame by frame and record that along. But it only works for some games, because there's only so much that you can expect when you have the tools available. So like libtas will work with ScumVM, which is very useful for all the point and click games that I've mentioned. So basically, anything that's by Humongous Entertainment, so like Freddy Fish and Pajama Sam, etc. And then Myst and Riven will also work in that framework, and pretty much anything will fit in there. Outside of that, it's a crapshoot. It basically comes down to maybe this game will, maybe it won't. With a bunch of tweaking, you'll have to see. So when it comes to like the actual technical way, the precise way of tasking it, it happens to be particularly simple for the games that I've done, which is basically watch the world record, see if it's perfect, especially for the Humongous Entertainment games where Plank Boy is perfect, and basically just one frame click, one frame stop clicking, move mouse, one frame click, next frame stop clicking, etc., and then it just plays through perfectly. There's a little bit of intrigue with trying to find task only strats, but like there's only so much that you can do with a point and click game. You can't like skip things, you can't find a task only movement strategy. It's basically click and don't click, etc. And I've done a little bit of work. The one that I put the most work into was the first ever putt game where you have a lot of downtime. So I'm trying to figure out different things to do with cursors and stuff like that, all the interesting sort of task stuff. But like other than that, for the most part, it's just play the game perfectly. There's a little bit of RNG manipulation that does come into that, where you try to start the game at a different time to see if you can get the RNG to play differently. I've written a couple of scripts doing that with like Python and et cetera. But for the most part, it's pretty cut and dry.
This is super fascinating, and I'm just curious about the technical parts of it. We've had a fair amount of taskers on the podcast, and typically we bring a ROM into an emulator, and then we start doing this. Is it the same process, or are you actually bringing inputs to the game? Like, what's the process there? That's super fascinating.
As far as I can tell, what the program does is it acts as sort of like a wrapper around the actual executable. Okay. So basically, you have libtask running, and then you say start the game, and then it starts the game. But then it doesn't do anything with the inputs. It doesn't emulate the necessary computer cycles to get it. And then when you want an input to go, it'll do 1/60th of a second of those computer cycles. And as long as there's not anything problematic that gets in the way, like round robin scheduling or like IO or trying to read from a disk or whatever, a bunch of stuff that normally is unavoidable, but thankfully with these really super old games, you can.
Right.
As long as nothing super complicated gets in the way, it'll make it to the next part. and then you can record an input for that by just like clicking on the screen and then advancing a frame or whatever you need to do. You can have it basically play the entire thing, and then you record the entire thing through. You can do re-records with save states. Thank God, because without save states, it would be really rough. But it turns out, especially with a lot of these older games, saving the RAM is a couple of megabytes, right? So you save the entire state of it and you can go back to that at any time. And then it just saves this text document. Essentially, you can open it as a text document. And then when it wants to play it again, it opens the executable and it emulates those inputs at those times. And it works. It just works. I don't bother to look under the hood. If anything goes wrong, I'll just say, we'll try something else. The guy who made it, absolute genius. I appreciate him for it. Gallo.
Clement
it's fine.
Gallet.
Look up Libtest.
Yeah, that's what.
Clement Gallet. Yes.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Yeah. Very, very smart guy. I worked with him a little bit on Limbo when I was trying to do that. And that game happens to be just barely advanced enough to where it almost doesn't work. So, although I may come back to that, who knows? But as it turns out, it's just a matter of moving the game forward a bit. There's no loading a ROM. It's just a wrapper around an executable, and it just works fine. So.
That was actually one of the things I wanted to ask you about as we get towards the end here. It was I noticed some of your Limbo runs, and Limbo is a game that I really enjoyed my playthrough. It's a really fun game, but it's a little bit different from some of the other games that I've noticed on your speedrunning list. What was it about that game that you enjoyed playing through? And I don't know if you still played it all today, but what was it about that game that got you going?
I don't know. I mean, here, I'll try to walk through it. So I started with 140. I talked about that a little bit. It's a little rhythm platforming game that actually plays very similar to Super Mario Bros, where it has like frame rolls almost. And it's basically, you can just move from one part to another, but like every so often there's something really difficult that you have to do or whatever.
Right.
So it sort of plays like that, and that's a very easy speed game to get into, 140, because it basically teaches you all the things where it's like it's not expecting you to do too much, and to play at a very high level you just have to do everything perfectly.
Right.
So that's fantastic. But 140 was made by a guy named Jeppe Carlson, and he worked on Limbo, and they were like, hey, you should play Limbo, and I'd never played Limbo before, so I played Limbo. And I really liked it a lot. I liked the aesthetic of the game, but as it turns out, there's a lot of, for as simple as the physics in that game are, there's a lot of intrigue and a lot of tempting possibilities there, because the game is built sort of linearly, but every so often like a path will cross in a way that you wouldn't expect. Like there's a section in the game where there's an arrow sign that falls into a section that happens a minute later in the speedrun. And in theory, if you could manipulate your momentum in such a way to launch off of that arrow, you might be able to skip that minute. Turns out you probably can't, because we've spent hundreds of hours trying to do it, but like there's a tempting possibility. And there's other things where you can skip stuff like that. There's a very famous Limbo skip called Tree Skip, where you can manipulate box momentum to fling you across a river you normally couldn't, and it saves like 30 seconds. And it's for a game as simple as Limbo, there's a lot to it in the momentum perspective. And also there's the very small optimizations when it comes to movement, because the movement style is basically you jump and then you wait until he recovers from that animation and then you jump again. And that happens to be like the fastest way. And because the ground isn't flat, you have to slightly tweak that strategy as it's moving along on that terrain in order to get the optimal movement. And that's somehow endlessly fascinating. I don't know. I spent more of my time doing glitch hunting in that game than I did the hyper optimization stuff. So I was never top tier at that game, but for the most part, I was decent enough to get by. And also I was looking for a lot of glitches in that game that were super interesting. So
I guess I probably one of the ways that, and the reasons I ended up finding was it because I think it plays like on everything. It seemed like it's available on every platform, which is helpful too,
Yeah.
So, that's really cool. I'm looking forward to actually going into and watching some of your gameplay of it, because I didn't get a chance to get through that for this, and it's a game I really found it moved me in some ways, because it's this black and white stuff. If you haven't played Limbo, it really evokes some emotion out of you. It really puts you in a vibe, or there's this aesthetic to it, as we talked about before, that is kind of it felt unique when I first played through it. I hadn't played through a game like it. I thought it was really cool. Okay, cool. So I really appreciate you taking the time and sharing a lot about this stuff. I really I enjoy your speedrunning. I enjoy the way that you're able to like articulate some of these things, because for those of us who have no idea how some of this works, it's real. I really appreciate hearing the knowledge and things through it. And I'm glad that you keep speedrunning this day, because you've been doing it for a while now. So the fact that you keep going, I'm glad you do. It's fun to watch, to say the least.
Cool. Thank you. That's really cool to hear.
If anybody's curious and wants to get into what you're doing, where can people find you? What is maybe a resource you can send people if they're at all interested in this kind of stuff?
I mean, if you're interested in puzzle gaming in general, you just sort of pick the puzzle game that you want, and you just go through it normally. Especially nowadays, there's a Discord for every single game.
Yes.
The one that I manage is Superliminal, which happens to be a hyper popular puzzle speedrun game. It's probably one of the top speedrun games at the moment. So if you're interested in that, go for it. If you're sort of interested in seeing what I do, which I guess that's cool. I have a YouTube channel where I almost in a very unsorted, chaotic sort of way post everything that I find as a clip. So that's how I choose to archive everything that I found, useful or not, in various different video games. And in theory, you should be able to just look up my name followed by whatever game I've worked on, and there should be oodles and oodles. I used to try to keep them in playlists, but it just doesn't work. So you can follow me on YouTube. It should be relatively easy to find, I should hope.
I will include the link in the notes in the description for the podcast.
That'd be rad. Yeah.
And you do stream. You're on Twitch. I noticed you're mostly on weekends, but I don't know if you get a chance. I don't know if that's a set thing or anything like that.
I don't have a schedule.
Okay.
I've streamed the most times that I have most recently. It's sometimes it'll be once a month. Sometimes it'll be whenever. I recently haven't had the time because I've just been working. But every so often I'll stream or whatever. So just whenever, I don't have a schedule or whatever. I'm a speedrunner, not a streamer. So
totally. And there's one thing I do got to ask about it, because you did mention it, is that one thing I noticed about the communities that you've associated with is anytime somebody's speedrunning or attempting Myst, 15 Myst speedrunners end up you all are passionate and great about getting in the same place with somebody. Can you talk a little bit about the community and they seem pretty awesome, to say the least. I think that's awesome that happens.
Yeah. I mean, especially with a game like Myst that has moved so many people towards this sort of thing, the speedrunning crowd has attracted people who like the game a lot, almost to a fault, to where they play the game on a regular basis. And so we happen to not only be very, very appreciative of the game, but we also understand, the importance of letting someone figure something else on their own, et cetera. So we don't usually tend to be a problematic sort of viewer experience. It just sort of happens, where it's hey, this person's playing it casually, and it's oh, cool, someone else is playing Myst, because everyone plays Myst differently. Everyone gets caught up on something differently. Everyone
so interesting.
Comes up with some different approach to it, and it's interesting to see that sort of thought process. For most of us, I get a little bit too frustrated at times, because it's right there, but everyone else is really cool.
They're really excited about it.
I like to pop in every so often. Yeah,
that's cool, man.
Shivers is very similar too, because Shivers is an obscure as hell game.
Yeah,
so anytime anyone plays that's anyone who's ever played Shivers ever ends up becoming a speedrunner. Or whatever, So, or anyone who likes it at the very least. So very similar sort of approach with these old games, where it's the speedrunners happen to be the people who are the super fans of it, and that's just how it is, So
it seems like pretty fun and pretty cool. It's great that there is a community around it. So if you're all interested in speedrunning, that there is a community out there for you, and it sounds like a good place to hang out if you're into it. So anyway, Gelly, thank you so much. I really do appreciate it, and thanks for sharing us the history, and then also some of the details and the nuts and bolts about how some of these games work. Thanks for sharing your time, man.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you for having me. I really appreciate being able to talk about it, because it's just sort of up there. So like, every so often someone will ask me something and I'll go into it for 15 minutes. So being able to get it all out there for someone it's always a joy. I always appreciate talking about it.
Totally, man. Thanks everyone for listening, watching, viewing, liking, subscribing, and sharing. All of that stuff goes a long way to helping out the podcast. If you'd like any additional info, you can go to sequencebreakpodcast.com. All of our past episodes, everything's on there. You'll find everything there. If you'd like to watch live, follow the Sequence Break Twitter. That is Sequence Break PC, and you can join in, ask some questions, watch the whole thing live. It does happen. It's not really a set time, but I do post when I go live. Everything else, if you have any questions or anything like that, podcast at sequencebreakpodcast.com. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.